Well, hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Apologetics Academy. If you are joining us for the first time or haven't been before, then you are especially welcome. Every Saturday, I run a live interactive apologetics webinar where we bring on different scholars, apologists, experts, authorities from across the theological and philosophical spectrum to present on topics of interest to Christians, particularly those topics which pertain to the question of whether or not the gospel is true. And we also cross-examine and evaluate other worldviews as well, including Islam, Mormonism, atheism, and so on. Following a presentation by the guest speaker, then we open up to open floor Q&A, discussion, dialogue, and debate. You can find the website of the Apologetics Academy at the URL apologetics-academy.org. If you click on online apologetics training, you can see the upcoming schedule for the upcoming weeks and months ahead. So just to give you an idea of what's coming up in the next few weeks. Next week, we actually have with us Mary Jo Sharp from Confident Christianity. The specific subject is yet to be confirmed because we might have to revise the topic that we were going to do originally. But the following week, on June 24th, we have with us Dr. Brian Miller from the Discovery Institute, who's going to be giving us a presentation about thermodynamics and the origins of life. And then the following week on July 1st, we have Dr. Andrew Fabich, who is a microbiologist who supports intelligent design, and he is going to be presenting a critique of a popular argument for common ancestry, namely the nested hierarchical distribution of endogenous retroviruses in primate genomes. Then the following week on July 8th, we have with us Hilary Ferrer, who is going to be giving us a presentation on diagnosing doubt, how to stop wasting time answering the wrong questions. So coming back to tonight, I am actually going to be giving a webinar presentation on undesigned coincidences in the scriptures and argument of their veracity. And as I've said before, the normal format is that we have a lecture presentation, and then we open up for open floor Q&A and dialogue. If you would like to interact during the Q&A portion of the program, you can do so by submitting a question in a textual form. You can hit the Q&A button at the top of your screen and type in a question anonymously if you wish, and then you can and then I will address your question when the appropriate time comes. You can also submit questions using the Facebook comments feature at the Facebook live stream. And you can also click the raise hand button on the Zoom application, and I will promote you to be a co-panelist with me, and we'll have a back and forth dialogue, and then move on to the next caller and so on. Okay. Okay, so on the screen here, you should see my PowerPoint presentation on undesigned coincidences in the scriptures. One sec. Okay, on the screen here, you should see my PowerPoint presentation, Undesigned Coincidences in the Scriptures, an argument for their veracity. And over the course of this presentation, I'm going to be discussing what undesigned coincidences are. I'll be giving an introduction to the subject for those who maybe haven't encountered them before. And I'll be surveying some examples of undesigned coincidences, both in the Gospels, as well as in Acts and the epistles, as well as in the Old Testament. And we'll be looking at how we can use undesigned coincidences to support the substantial veracity of the scriptures and also the authorship of various books of scripture, in particular the epistles of Paul. And I would actually argue we can use undesigned coincidences to show that all 13 of the letters traditionally ascribed to the Apostle Paul are indeed authentic and Pauline. And obviously, because this is a very, very broad subject, I can't do justice to the topic with one lecture. And so this is literally just going to scrape the surface. There's a lot more to be said about undesigned coincidences, and I'll be recommending a few books that you might want to purchase and dig your teeth into if you would like to pursue this topic further. So let's talk first of all about the discovery of undesigned coincidences. Well, here to the left, you can see a very famous Christian from the 1700s by the name of William Paley. And you might recognize the name of William Paley. He's particularly famous for his watchmaker thesis, which he developed in his book Natural Theology, which is his most famous work. He also wrote a book called Horae Paulinae, which you can see pictured to your right on the screen. And in Horae Paulinae, which is the Latin title, which is literally translated the Hours of Paul, William Paley sought to corroborate the substantial veracity of the Book of Acts and also the genuineness or authenticity of the Pauline epistles, the epistles ascribed to the Apostle Paul. And he sought to do so by virtue of an argument that he called undesignedness, or undesigned coincidences. And we'll be looking at what these are in due course. This argument was subsequently, William Paley subsequently published another book called A View of the Evidence of Christianity, in which he also developed this argument even further, looking at examples in the Gospels. Then John James Blunt in 1847 came along with this book on undesigned coincidences in the Old and New Testament, an argument of their veracity. And he put forward this argument, giving examples in the Old Testament, which was a new contribution, as well as examples in the Gospels, and also in between the Gospels, Acts, and Josephus. The argument largely became lost to history after Blunt, and very few apologists used the argument until very, very recently, until the argument was somewhat resurrected, if you will, by Dr. Lydia McGrew, who is a philosopher who published this book recently, which actually just came out in 2017, called Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. And so she looked at examples in particular that confirm the substantial veracity of the Gospels and Acts, confirming indeed that the Gospels and Acts go back to apostolic testimony and indeed the testimony of credible eyewitnesses. So let me begin by giving an introduction to undesigned coincidences and a discussion of how we can use them to corroborate biblical history. Well, first of all, we need to know, what is an undesigned coincidence? Perhaps some of you in the audience haven't heard this term before. Well, sometimes two works by different authors interlock in a way that would be very unlikely if one of them were copied from the other, or both were copied from a common source. For example, one book may mention in passing in a detail that answers some question raised by the other. The two records fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So William Paley, in his Horae Paulinae, which remember is discussing undesigned coincidences that occur between Acts and the epistles of Paul, he writes about it in the following terms. He says, "In examining, therefore, the agreement between ancient writings, the character of truth and originality is undesignedness. And this test applies to every supposition, for whether we suppose the history to be true, but the letters spurious, or the letters to be genuine but the history false, or lastly, falsehood to belong to both, the history to be a fable, and the letters fictitious, the same inference will result, that either there will be no agreement between them, or the agreement will be the effect of design. Nor will it elude the principle of this rule to suppose the same person to have been the author of all the letters, or even the author both of the letters and the history. For no less design is necessary to produce coincidence between different parts of a man's own writings, especially when they are made to take the different forms of history and of original letters, than to adjust them to the circumstances found in any other writing." Now, let me illustrate this principle of undesignedness by giving an example from the Gospel. Suppose you are inventing a Gospel story, and the setup for your miracle story is going to have to do with money and food. Now, which disciple do you pick? Well, you might want to say, well, I'd pick Matthew, who was a tax collector and knew a thing or two about money, or you might say Judas Iscariot, who was in charge of the money bag, or someone like that. If we turn to the Gospel of John in chapter 6 and verse 5, we read, this is the setup for the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" Now, this raises a natural question in the audience's mind. Why does he turn to Philip here in particular? Philip is a fairly minor character in the Gospels. Again, why not turn to someone who is more prominent, in particular someone perhaps like Judas, who was in charge of the money bag, or someone like that? Why does he in particular choose Philip? Well, if we look at Luke's account in Luke chapter 9 and verses 10 and 11, we read, on their return, this is also the feeding of the 5,000, on their return, the apostles told him all that they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. When the crowd learned it, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing. Now flip over to John 12. So this is, remember, 6 chapters removed from the feeding of the 5,000 in John 6, a completely different context. And in John 12, verse 21, it says, so these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. So let's put the pieces together. Luke doesn't mention Philip in this context at all. In fact, it just says in Luke, he turned to the disciples. John doesn't mention Bethsaida as the setting of the miracle story. Only by putting them together can we understand why Jesus speaks to Philip in John 6:5. So John chapter 6 tells us that Jesus turned to Philip to say, where should we send these people to buy bread? Luke chapter 9 mentions that the event takes place in the town of Bethsaida. And John chapter 12 mentions that Philip is from Bethsaida. So only by putting these pieces together like a jigsaw can we understand why Jesus turns to Philip in John 6:5. This is the sort of pattern which we expect in a work of history rather than a work of fiction. But wait, there's more. There's also an account of this miracle in Mark chapter 6. According to Mark 6, we read, and he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going. Now bear that in mind. And they had no leisure even to eat. And in verse 39, then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, about that green grass, in Palestine, the grass is actually brown throughout the entire year, as you can see in the photograph, except at a very narrow window of time because of different levels of rainfall at the time of the Jewish Passover. But now we turn to the Gospel of John in chapter 6. And John doesn't mention the people coming and going, indicating it's very busy. And he doesn't mention the green grass. But what does he tell us in verse 5? The Jewish Passover festival was near. And so putting the pieces together, again, we can understand why Mark mentions the people coming and going, indicating the busyness and the fact that the grass is green. But notice that Mark doesn't mention the Jewish Passover festival was near, and John doesn't mention the green grass of the people coming and going. It's only by putting the pieces together from the different Gospels that we can make sense of this. But there's more concerning the feeding of the 5,000 in Bethsaida. Consider Matthew 11, verse 21, where Jesus pronounces woes and judgment upon the unrepentant cities of Chorazin and Bethsaida. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented a long time ago in sackcloth and ashes. Now you might wonder, what mighty works were performed in Bethsaida? Matthew doesn't tell us. Nothing Matthew has reported up to this point gives us any clue. We find out, however, in Luke's account, chapter 9, verse 10, that the feeding of the 5,000 miracle took place in Bethsaida. Although Matthew 14 does narrate the feeding of the 5,000, no mention is made of Bethsaida, and moreover, Matthew, who often arranges his material thematically rather than chronologically, tells the story of the feeding of the 5,000 3 chapters after the pronouncement of woe to Bethsaida. Only by comparing Luke's account do we discover that the feeding actually took place before Jesus pronounced the woes over Bethsaida, Luke 10:13. And moreover, here's another example of an undesigned coincidence pertaining to the feeding of the 5,000. How did they know the number of people? Have you ever wondered that? Matthew's account of the feeding of the 5,000 emphasizes that the number refers specifically to males. It says, and those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The statement that about 5,000 men were fed also occurs in Mark 6:44, Luke 9:14, and John 6:10, although these Gospels don't add besides women and children. Now, how is this number calculated? Well, according to Mark 6, then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass, so they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. Similarly, Luke 9 says, and he said to his disciples, have them sit down in groups of about 50 each, and they did so and had them all sit down. No doubt, having the crowd sorted into groups made it easier to distribute food to them, and it also made it possible to get some idea of how many there were. But how did they know how many men there were, excluding women and children? John makes no mention of the groupings, but his account adds a crucial piece of the puzzle. In John 6, we read, Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish as much as they wanted. Jesus tells the disciples to have the people sit down in groups, as Mark and Luke say, but it is the men who actually sit down, as John says. This explains how the number of men could be approximately counted. Perhaps the women and children were off playing somewhere else, but it was actually the men who sat down according to what John tells us, which explains how they could count the approximate number of males in addition to women and children. Now, what is the significance of these undesigned coincidences? Well, one undesigned coincidence might be an accident, like having 2 unrelated pieces of a jigsaw puzzle fit together just by chance. But if we discover numerous undesigned coincidences crisscrossing the documents, it becomes ridiculous to insist that they are all just accidental. So let's consider some more examples of undesigned coincidences from the Gospels. Consider in Mark 14:58, when Jesus is before the high priest Caiaphas, and the false witnesses step forward to testify falsely against Jesus. And it says in Mark 14:58, which is also parallel to Matthew 26:61, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands. In Mark 15:29 and also Matthew 27 verse 40, when Jesus is on the cross, we read, and those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Now you'll notice that in neither Matthew nor in Mark do we read of Jesus having said this or anything even approximating to this. In fact, this saying that's attributed falsely to Jesus actually was not said by Jesus, and they've completely misrepresented Jesus on this point. Nothing in the Synoptic Gospels provides any pretext for this accusation. But it doesn't seem to be the sort of saying that's being fabricated out of whole cloth, but rather something which is rather a garbled version of something that Jesus most likely said, especially in view of the reference to the 3 days, which is often associated with Jesus' resurrection predictions. Flip over to John's account in chapter 2, verses 18 and 19. This is the independent non-synoptic gospel. And John writes, so the Jews said to Jesus, what sign do you show us for doing these things? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And of course they say, well, it's taken us 46 years to build this temple. How then can you say you'll destroy it and raise it again in 3 days? But of course the temple he's speaking of is his body, and he's speaking about his resurrection from the dead. And so just as in the Holy of Holies, that's where in the temple, that's where the dwelling place of God was. Jesus, just as the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies to meet God, so Jesus is the man to whom we come to meet God. In Christ's body is the dwelling place of God himself. And so that's the imagery that he was using at that point. And it says that after Jesus had been raised from the dead, then the disciples remembered the words that Jesus had spoken, and they believed the scriptures. Now, John gives us the original statement of Jesus, but not its use as an accusation. The synoptics give us the accusation, but not the original statement. Neither of these is copied from the other. Let's take another example. In Matthew 14, verses 1 and 2, we read, "At that time Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, 'This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him.'" This raises two natural questions. Number one, why is Herod talking about this matter to his servants? And number two, how would Matthew know what Herod had said to his servants, right? Have you ever wondered that? Flip over to Luke's account in chapter 8, and this is what we read in verses 1 through 3. "Soon afterward, he went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means." And so here we can see that Jesus actually had disciples, or in this case, one of his disciples was Joanna, who was the wife of Herod's own household manager, which explains why Herod may have been talking about this matter in particular to his servants, and also explains how Matthew may come to know that this is what Herod had said to his servants. And by the way, this example of an undesigned coincidence supports or corroborates Matthew's gospel as being finding its origin in apostolic testimony. Let's take another example. In John chapter 18, verses 10 and 11. This is when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the soldiers and the high priest come to arrest Jesus. It says, "Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, 'Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?'" And of course, the cup imagery in the Old Testament represented or symbolized God's wrath, his fury, his judgment against the nations, that God handed to the nations his cup of divine fury as his judgment and wrath upon them. But Jesus uses the cup imagery to represent the fact that he is going to consume the wrath of God in our behalf. What's interesting here is that that nowhere else in John does Jesus use this imagery of the cup. This is the only occurrence in John's gospel of the cup imagery. However, if we flip, and so this raises the question, why does Jesus use this image of the cup right here in this context in particular? If we flip over to to the Synoptic Gospels, they tell us that Jesus prayed that night in these very terms, asking that the Father would take from him the necessity of suffering crucifixion, calling it the cup. When Judas and the soldiers come to arrest Jesus, Jesus evidently accepted this as the Father's decision to give him the cup. This hand-in-glove fit, or undesigned coincidence, if you will, supports the veracity of this saying. So the Synoptics have Jesus praying that very night in these very terms, saying, "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, But the synoptics don't report Jesus saying, after Peter has struck off the ear of the servant of the high priest, must I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? The synoptics do not report that. John does report that, but he doesn't report that Jesus had just been praying that night in these very terms, saying, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. So again, this hand-in-glove fit, this undesigned coincidence, supports the historical veracity of this saying. Let's take another example from the Gospels. This is in Mark 15, verses 42 through 45. And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. Now notice that Mark takes particular note of Joseph's courage. It says that he took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Why might Mark take particular note of Joseph's courage? Well, I've discussed before, I won't get into it here for the purpose of time, but there's good evidence, both internal and external, that Mark's gospel is based upon the eyewitness testimony of the Apostle Peter. And Peter, of course, had a lack of courage at the time of the crucifixion, denying his Lord 3 times, and so he may have had great respect for Joseph, who would step forward in courage. So that's something which is interesting. But why does Mark take notice of Joseph's courage? If we flip over to John's account, John chapter 19, Joseph tells us about the same event, but he doesn't mention that he doesn't emphasize the courage of Joseph like Mark does. But what he does is he says, after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight. And so Mark tells us that Joseph was courageous in going to see Pilate, but doesn't mention why that was particularly noteworthy for Joseph. But John doesn't mention or doesn't emphasize the courage of Joseph, but gives us the reason why Mark would take note of the courage of Joseph, that he had been a secret disciple for fear of the Jews. Again, an undesigned coincidence. There's another example in John chapter 19, verses 41 and 42. This is the burial of Jesus. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. Now, Matthew chapter 27 says, when it was evening, there came a... so the question that's raised here is, how did they come to have a new tomb that was ready? In Matthew 27, we read, when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who also was a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him, and Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and went away. Oops. Now, only Matthew mentions that Joseph of Arimathea was rich. Only Matthew mentions that Joseph laid Jesus in his own tomb. Although Matthew's wording and details about the burial are similar to Mark's, example, the linen sheet, the tomb being cut out of the rock, mention of Joseph rolling the stone across the entrance, and the two Marys who saw where Jesus was laid, Matthew's unique material illuminates John's account and reveals that Matthew has access to material independent of Mark concerning Jesus' burial. In addition to explaining John, Matthew also explains Luke. Luke and John both leave the reader to conjecture that the tomb may have belonged to Joseph. While Matthew says that the tomb was new, he does not use the expression in which no one had yet been laid, whereas both Luke and John do. Luke strongly emphasizes the goodness of Joseph, which makes it surprising if he were copying from Matthew that he doesn't also mention that it was Joseph's own tomb in order to have a reason to praise Joseph further. Other features Luke mentions, whereas Matthew does not, include Joseph being a member of the Sanhedrin, him waiting for the kingdom. Luke is sufficiently independent of Matthew to conclude that it's unlikely he is simply inferring from Matthew's word "new" that no one had previously been laid in the tomb. John's unique material on the burial include Nicodemus, Joseph's previous secret discipleship, the nearness of the tomb to the place of crucifixion, the fact that the tomb was in a garden, the quantity of spices used in the burial. John agrees with Luke on the claim that no one had used the tomb previously, whereas Matthew alone explains how it came about that Joseph had access to the never-used tomb. Here's another example. This is actually interesting because this is an example of an undesigned coincidence which occurs in a post-resurrection scene. So in John chapter 21, verse 15, this is when Jesus takes Simon Peter aside. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now, why does Jesus ask Peter whether he loves him more than the others do? The explanation is given in Matthew 26:33. Peter answered him, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." Matthew records, though John does not, Peter's boast that he was the most faithful of Jesus' disciples. Although John is the only gospel in which we have Jesus saying to Peter after the resurrection, "Do you truly love me more than these?" Again, a hand-in-glove fit, an undesigned coincidence corroborating the veracity of the narrative. Let's look at examples of undesigned coincidences that occur between the Gospels and external secular sources. This is from the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 2 and verse 22. But when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then, after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee. This is just after the flight to Egypt on their return. And it raises the question, why was Joseph so afraid of Herod Archelaus? This is the only mention of Archelaus in the entire Bible. He's mentioned in the context of Joseph being afraid of him when he hears that Archelaus is reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod. Now, Josephus, Flavius Josephus, being a great, very well-known first-century Jewish and Roman court historian, he says in his Antiquities of the Jews, volume 17, that the domain of Herod the Great was divided among his sons, with Archelaus having authority in Judea but not in Galilee, which was governed by his younger brother, Herod Antipas. We also know that Archelaus had acquired quite a bloody reputation. In one of these references in Josephus, we learn that Archelaus, because of a riot that broke out among the Jews, resulting in the death of some of his men, he, in a rage, sent his entire army upon the Jewish temple. He locked the doors and slaughtered 3,000 Jews in the temple and announced that Passover was cancelled. And so thus Joseph decides not to return to Judea, and instead he goes further north to the regions of Galilee governed by Herod Antipas. And let's talk about getting the titles right. In Matthew 2:22, Archelaus is reigning as king in Judea. In Matthew 27:2, Pilate is governor of Judea. In Acts 12:1, Herod is king of Judea. And in Acts 23:33, Felix is governor of Judea. This becomes extremely confusing. But here's the thing. Josephus attests to the accuracy of every one of these titles. Herod the Great was made king of Judea by Mark Antony. Archelaus was deposed in the year 6 AD after only a 10-year reign, and a series of procurators ruled over Judea, of whom Pilate was fifth. The Herod of Acts 12 is Agrippa I. He was made king by Claudius Caesar. After his death, Judea was once again placed under the government of procurators, one of them being Felix. What about the proconsuls in the book of Acts? When Luke tells us of the riot in Ephesus, he reports that the city clerk tells the crowd that there are proconsuls. Now, what's a proconsul? Well, a proconsul is a Roman authority to whom a complaint may be taken. Normally, there would only be one proconsul. However, just at that particular time, there seems to have been two as a result of the assassination of Silenus, the previous proconsul, by poisoning in the fall of AD 54 by the two imperial stewards at the urging of Nero's mother. And this event is independently documented by Tacitus in his Annals of Imperial Rome. Indeed, Luke's accuracy has even allowed historians to date the event, which Luke narrates with incredible precision, since we know when Silenus was poisoned. And so this then explains or addresses the question, why does the cleric tell the crowd that there are proconsuls in the plural, when in fact normally there would only be one? So this is one of the more difficult details that in fact Luke gets right in the book of Acts. Here's another example pertaining to the death of John the Baptist. According to Mark 6:27, Herod Antipas sent a military officer, that's what speculatura means, to execute John the Baptist. Why would he not send a civil executioner? Well, interestingly, Flavius Josephus also narrates the event of the execution of John the Baptist. And the answer is found in his Antiquities of the Jews, volume 18. Herod was at war at the time with his former father-in-law, Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans. And so this explains why he had a military officer carry out the execution. He was at Machaerus on a military campaign, not at home in his palaces in Galilee. Another example. This is from Acts 5:17. Then the high priest rose up, and all they that were with him, which is the sect of the Sadducees, and were filled with indignation. Luke here intimates that the high priest was a Sadducee, which is as a character one would not have expected to meet with in that station. The circumstance, however, remarkable as it is, was not without examples. For example, Josephus in Antiquities volume 13 tells us that John Hyrcanus, high priest of the Jews, forsook the Pharisees upon disgust and joined himself to the party of the Sadducees. Again, in his Antiquities of the Jews volume 10, he tells us this Ananus the younger, who, as we have said just now, had received the high priesthood, was fierce and haughty in his behavior, and above all men, bold and daring, and moreover was of the sect of the Sadducees. And this high priest lived only a little more than 20 years after the event recorded in Acts. Here's another example pertaining to the office of the high priest. According to Matthew 26, verse 3, then the chief priests, which is exactly the same expression in Greek for the high priests, and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas. Wait a minute. Wasn't there supposed to be only one high priest? I mean, if you know your Old Testament, you know there was only ever one high priest. Why do the Gospels have there being two high priests? Did they make a mistake here? Well, according to, and it gets worse, because according to John 11:49, it says, but one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them. Now, wait a minute. Wasn't the office of high priest a lifelong occupation? Has John again made an error here? Now, the Caiaphas was high priest and high priest throughout the reign of Pontius Pilate, and consequently at this time appears in Josephus' Antiquities volume 18. Caiaphas was made high priest by Valerius Gratus, predecessor of Pontius Pilate, and was removed from his office by Vitellius, president of Syria, after Pilate was sent away out of the province of Judea. That's from Antiquities volume 17. Here's a text from Antiquities volume 18. Gratus gave the high priesthood to Simon, the son of Camathus. He, having enjoyed this honor not above a year, was succeeded by Joseph, who is called Caiaphas. So that explains why John 11 says high priest that year. After this, Gratus went away for Rome, having been 11 years in Judea, and Pontius Pilate was his successor. Of the removal of Caiaphas from his office, Josephus likewise afterwards informs us, and connects it with a circumstance with which fixes the time to a date subsequent to the determination of Pilate's government. Antiquities volume 17. We read, Vitellius ordered Pilate to repair to Rome, and after that went up himself to Jerusalem, and then gave directions concerning several matters. And having done these things, he took away the priesthood from the high priest Joseph, who is called Caiaphas. Here's another example pertaining to the office of high priest. In Acts 23, verses 4 and 5, those who stood by said, "Would you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest." It turns out that Ananias, of whom this is spoken, was in truth not the high priest, though he was sitting in judgment in that assumed capacity. The case was that he had formerly held the office and had been deposed, and the person who succeeded him had been murdered, that another was not yet appointed to the station, and that during the vacancy he had, of his own authority, taken upon himself the discharge of the office. This singular situation of the high priesthood took place during the interval between the death of Jonathan, who was murdered by order of Felix, and the accession of Ismail, who was invested with the high priesthood by Agrippa. And precisely in this interval, it happened that the Apostle Paul was apprehended and brought before the Jewish council. So let's look at examples of undesigned coincidences that occur between Paul's letters and Acts. And I'll also give a couple examples of ones that just occur between Paul's letters and each other. Let's start with this one from 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 1. Paul writes to the Corinthians, "Are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you?" If we look at Acts 18:27, it says, "And when he," as Apollos, "wished to cross to Achaia," that's where Corinth is, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. So the Emperor Augustus had made Corinth the capital of Achaia. Achaia is where Corinth was, and Apollos had a recommendation letter, and so that explains or illuminates what Paul is getting at in 2 Corinthians 3:1, where he says, "Are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you?" Here's another example pertaining to the Corinthians. Paul writes to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 1 verse 12, "Some of you are saying, I am a follower of Paul. Others are saying, I follow Apollos." In 1 Corinthians 3 verse 6, "I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth." Paul's language here suggests that Apollos came and preached at Corinth after Paul had left the city. This accords with the timeline in Acts 18:1 and Acts 18 verses 24 to 28, and also Acts 19 verse 1. What about Paul's short visit to the apostles? This is another example from Galatians chapter 1 verse 18. It says, Paul writes, "Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas," that's Peter, "and remained with him 15 days. Why does Paul have take only such a short visit to go and see the Apostle Peter, one of the leaders, one of the makers and shakers in the early church? Why such a short visit? Well, why was Paul's visit cut short? Well, the answer is given in Acts 9:29. In Acts 9:29, we read, "And he spoke and disputed against the Hellenists, but they were seeking to kill him. And when the brothers learned this, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus." No further comment is necessary. Here's another example. This is from this is from 1 Corinthians 4, verse 17. He says, "That is why I sent you Timothy." So apparently Timothy's already been sent when he's writing to the Corinthian church. But 1 Corinthians 16:10, the same letter, he writes, "When Timothy comes." So Paul evidently expects this letter to arrive before Timothy does. We therefore infer that Timothy must have taken some indirect route to Corinth. In Acts 19:21, we see that he did take such a route, going up and around through Macedonia. Here we see a map, the route taken by Timothy from Ephesus, where he was writing the letter to the Corinthians, up round through Macedonia to Corinth in Achaia, whereas presumably the letter was sent over the Aegean Sea, overseas, by boat. And so then it explains why Paul would say, that is why I sent you Timothy, and when Timothy comes. So he expects the letter to arrive before Timothy does, even though Timothy's already been sent at the time of his writing. Paul's ministry change in Acts 18, 3-5. This is what we read. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers, and he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Now, wait a minute. Paul began devoting himself completely to the word? Was he not before? Well, the answer is given. The question is, what caused the shift from Paul's working all week and doing evangelism on the Sabbath to his devoting himself completely to the word? It's apparently had something to do with the arrival of Silas and Timothy from Macedonia. And it's possible that even the author of Acts, namely Luke, didn't know the reason. Maybe this is just an observation that he was making. Luke, remember, was a traveling companion of Paul, and he may not have known why the sudden change in Paul's ministry model. But the answer is given by Paul himself in the second epistle to the Corinthian church in chapter 11, verses 8 and 9. He says, I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way. So now we understand why Paul changed his ministry model, because the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied for his needs. And by the way, 2 Corinthians and Acts are very, very clearly literarily independent of one another. For example, the list in 2 Corinthians 11 of Paul's sufferings, the big laundry list he gives, cannot be reconstructed from Acts. Also, there's the prominent character in the book of 2 Corinthians by the name of Titus, who was never even mentioned in the book of Acts. Also in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul mentions working miracles in Corinth, which you would expect Luke to include in Acts had he read 2 Corinthians and was simply copying from it. But there's no miracle mentioned in the book of Acts pertaining to Corinth. So these are literally independent of one another, and 2 Corinthians addresses or explains or answers a natural question raised by Acts in this case. Here's another example. Why did Barnabas want to take Mark with him? If we look at Acts 15 and verses 37-41, we read, now Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Now, why does Barnabas want to take Mark with him? Why is he so adamant that he wants Mark to travel with him, even though Mark has withdrawn from Paul and Barnabas in Pamphylia on a mission? The question is answered in Colossians 4, verse 10. As we read, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning him you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. Now, what's interesting is that Colossians nowhere even mentions this fallout with Barnabas over John Mark. In fact, Mark here sends his greetings. So it seems that obviously Paul and Mark had made up with each other and we're now on good terms again. So the author, so Paul here in Colossians is not fabricating this detail about Mark being the cousin of Barnabas in order to explain Acts, because he doesn't even, according to Colossians, for all the reader knows, Paul and Mark have always been on good terms. But nonetheless, he tells us, he gives us this detail in passing as an off-the-cuff remark that Mark is the cousin of Barnabas, which then illuminates for us or explains why Barnabas might want to take Mark with him in the book of Acts. Here's another example, and this one supports the veracity, by the way, of the Pauline epistles, which are among the most disputed letters of the New Testament, certainly the most disputed of the New Testament letters written by Paul. And this is what Paul writes in 2 Timothy 3, verses 10 and 11. You, however, have followed my teaching, my conduct, my aim in life, my faith, my patience, my love, my steadfastness, my persecutions and sufferings that happened to me at Antioch, at Iconium, and at Lystra, which persecutions I endured, yet from them all the Lord rescued me. Now, the Antioch here mentioned was not Antioch, the capital of Syria, but rather Antioch in Pisidia, to which, as we read in Acts 13, Paul was sent along with Barnabas. The sufferings here mentioned by Paul are described in Acts 13 and Acts 14. Paul seems to imply that, that Timothy witnessed these persecutions that happened to him in these cities. According to Acts, Paul made a second missionary journey through the same country. The purpose for this trip is given in Acts 15, verse 36. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are. And so thus we learned that the purpose of the journey was to check on those who had been converted during the first journey to see how they were doing. In Acts 16, we further learn, Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman. He was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. We thus are informed that either Derbe or Lystra was Timothy's hometown. It's clear from the text that Timothy had already been converted by the time of this visit, and Paul himself refers to Timothy as my true child in the faith and my beloved child in both letters to Timothy. This indicates that Timothy was most likely Paul's own convert. It then follows that Timothy was almost certainly converted upon Paul's previous journey through these cities at just the time when the apostle had undergone the persecutions alluded to in his letter to Timothy. And this corroborates not only the authenticity of 2 Timothy here, but it also shows us that indeed, as Paul himself says, and as Luke says in the book of Acts, and as Clement of Rome says, and other authors say, Paul himself was willing to suffer for his faith. Here's another example that pertains to the pastoral epistles and supports the authorship of the pastorals. This is from 2 Timothy 3, verse 20. We read, Erastus remained at Corinth. Now, why would Erastus remain at Corinth? Well, presumably Corinth is Erastus's hometown, right? Well, if you look at Romans 16:23, it says, Gaius, who is host to me and to the whole church, greets you. Erastus, the city treasurer, and our brother Quartus greet you. So clearly, wherever Paul is writing to the church in Rome from, that's where Erastus's hometown is, and that's where Erastus is serving as the city treasurer. Now let's turn over to 2 Corinthians 9. We read, otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you are not ready, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you, for being so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead of you and arrange in advance for the gift you have promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exaction. So here, Paul notes that he's expecting a collection to be ready for him when he comes, and there's a collection that's currently being prepared as he writes. If we look over at the book of Romans in chapter 15, we read, for Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem, for they were pleased to do it, indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles had come to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to them in material blessings. When therefore I have completed this and delivered to them what is being collected, I will leave for Spain by way of you. So clearly this indicates that that the collection has been gotten ready, is ready to be sent. And so Paul is actually writing from Corinth to the church in Rome, which illuminates for us why in Romans 16:23 he mentions Erastus, the city treasurer, and also, more importantly, it illuminates 2 Timothy 3:20, Erastus remained at Corinth. Here's another example. The book of the Epistle to the Colossians is also very much a disputed letter of Paul among modern scholarship, and I would argue that just as with the pastoral epistles, the reasons for skepticism as to its authorship are rather misplaced and misguided, quite frankly. Here's an argument that I would make for the Pauline authorship of Colossians. There are others as well, but this is one example. In Colossians 4:9. Paul, when writing his greetings to the church in Colossae, he mentions Onesimus, or faithful and beloved brother, and then he mentions who is one of you. What does who is one of you mean? Well, presumably Onesimus is in fact a Colossian. He actually is from Colossae. Now, what else can we tell about Onesimus from the scriptures? Well, if you flip over to Philemon, Philemon is a book about a runaway slave who happened to be Onesimus, who ran away from his master Philemon. Onesimus meets Paul in Rome, and he comes to Christ, and Paul writes a letter to his slave master Philemon. In the introduction, or in the prologue to the epistle to Philemon, Paul writes, "To Philemon, our beloved fellow worker, and Apphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and the church in your house." So the book of Philemon makes the connection between Onesimus and Philemon. It doesn't mention, though, where either Philemon or Onesimus are from. What it does mention, however, is a certain Archippus, or fellow soldier. Well, who's Archippus? Flip back to Colossians 4:17 and say to Archippus, "See that you fulfill the ministry that you have received in the Lord." So Paul wants the Colossian church then to pass on a message to Archippus, which indicates wherever he's writing, that's where Archippus is from. But Philemon tells us that Archippus is from the same places as Philemon. So that indicates that Philemon must be from Colossae. And since Onesimus is the slave of Philemon, that indicates by extension that Onesimus must be from Colossae, which illuminates for us Colossians 4:9, Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you. Thus corroborating the Pauline authorship of Colossians. Let's look at some examples in the Old Testament now. Let's go over to 2 Samuel 15, verses 1 through 12. This is when King David's son, Absalom, is rebelling against King David. We read the following account. "After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom used to ride early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, 'From what city are you?' And when he said, 'Your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel,' Absalom would say to him, 'See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you.' Then Absalom would say, 'Oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice. And whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, 'Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived at Geshur in Aram, saying, If the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord.' The king said to him, 'Go in peace.' So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, 'As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at Hebron.' With Absalom went 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited guests, and they went in their innocence and knew nothing. And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilo. And the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing." Now, who was Ahithophel? In 2 Samuel 16:23, we read, "Now in those days the counsel that Ahithophel gave was as if one consulted the word of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel esteemed both by David and by Absalom." So Ahithophel the Gilonite is David's most trusted counselor and advisor. So why was Ahithophel so quick to turn on David and conspire against him along with Absalom? And why did Absalom think to himself, I'm going to rebel against my father, King David, so I'll send for his most trusted advisor, and I can count on him to join me. Well, there's an important clue given in 2 Samuel 23, which is 8 chapters removed from 2 Samuel 15, where we have the account of Absalom sending for Ahithophel. And this is a completely different context, completely unrelated part of the book. We read the following: and David set him over his bodyguard. And then it gives you a list of names of the bodyguards of King David. I want you to take particular note of 2 individuals in this list. One of them is Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, the Gilonite. That's in verse 34. And also in verse 39, Uriah the Hittite. Now, you might recall who Uriah the Hittite is. We learn from 2 Samuel 11. Remember, David is on his palace roof, and he looks over from his roof, and he sees the woman Bathsheba bathing. Well, this is the account of 2 Samuel 11. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So now we understand that that this woman, Bathsheba, that David is lusting after, is the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now, you might recall that we read in the previous text we looked at in 2 Samuel 23, that Eliam is the son of Ahithophel, and he's a colleague of Uriah. So this presumably explains how Uriah and Bathsheba may have met. But more to the point, it also explains why Ahithophel was so quick to turn on David, because we can infer from these texts, if we put 2 Samuel 11 together with 2 Samuel 23, we can infer that Ahithophel is the grandfather of Bathsheba. What it gets even more interesting, though, in 2 Samuel 16, it says, then Absalom said to Ahithophel, give your counsel, what shall we do? Ahithophel said to Absalom, go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench to your father, and the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Why did they pitch a tent for Absalom on the roof of the palace? Well, clearly that's where David saw Bathsheba bathing. That's where his lustful eye first caught her bathing. And so Ahithophel, her grandfather, wants his revenge. And so he says to Absalom to go and sleep with his father's concubines, and then he pitches a tent for Absalom specifically on the roof. That's the sort of pattern that that is expected in a work of history, not in a work of fiction. Notice that that's never spelled out in the text what Ahithophel's motive is for turning so quickly on David. It's only by putting different parts of the jigsaw puzzle together that we can understand why Ahithophel was so quick to turn on David. Here's another example from the Old Testament. This is another sort of undesignedness can sometimes arise when we examine cases where information is assumed by the author, although not explicitly spelled out. This may be called the uniformity of expressive silence, repeated omissions that have a meaning. So I'll give you a quick example from the New Testament, where you have Joseph, the father of Jesus, and he appears in Matthew and in Luke. And even in John, he's implied to have been alive at least at some point, because people say, is this not Jesus, whose father and mother we know? Whereas what's interesting is that he mysteriously disappears from the narrative. And in fact, what Jesus frequently refers to his mother and his brothers, but his father mysteriously disappears, and we're not given any information on what happened to him. And it suggests or implies that the authors of the Gospels know something more about Joseph than actually they write down for us, which is again a pattern that you expect in history, but not a pattern you expect in fiction, where you have these repeated omissions that have meaning. In fact, on the cross in John 19, Jesus entrusts the care of his mother Mary to the beloved disciple, even and raises the question, well, why not his father Joseph? Well, presumably Joseph is either dead or imbecilic or a leper. We don't know really what had happened, but it suggests that the author knows something more than he actually writes down for us. But here I'm going to give an example of this from the Old Testament. In Genesis 24, we have a story of Abraham's servant's journey to the city of Nahor in Mesopotamia in search of a wife for Isaac. He encounters Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, who came out with her water jar on her shoulder. Abraham's servant requests a drink of water from the jar. Rebekah gives him some water and also some for his camels to drink. In verses 22 through 28, we read what happened next. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing a half shekel and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels, and said, "Please tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" She said to him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor." She added, "We have plenty of both straw and fodder and room to spend the night." The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness towards my master. As for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman." Then the young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. Now, the point to which I wish to draw attention here is the consistent insignificance of Bethuel throughout the narrative. Bethuel was the father of Rebekah, and thus it's reasonable to expect that the terms of a marriage contract would be stipulated by him. Indeed, in the case of Laban in Genesis 29, in regards to his disposing of a daughter in marriage, a daughter who, like Rebekah, had brothers, we learn from Genesis 31, verse 1, the active party throughout the account is the father, Laban. Contrast this with the case of Bethuel in our current text in Genesis 24. Abraham's servant had asked her, "Please tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" Verse 23. We are then told, however, that the young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. Notice that we are not told that she ran to her father's household, as Rachel does in Genesis 29:12, after meeting Jacob, but rather she ran to her mother's household. Verse 29 further informs us, Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. Laban ran out toward the man to the spring. After having been invited into the house by Laban, the servant explains the purpose of his visit. In verse 50, we read, "Then Laban and Bethuel," that's her father, "answered and said," the mention of Bethuel here constitutes the only proof that he was alive at the time of this incident. "It is agreed that the servant may take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken," for verse 51. The servant then gives gifts, we are told, to Rebekah and to her brother and to her mother, verse 53. Curiously, no gifts are given to Bethuel, it would seem. In verse 55, we read, "Her brother and her mother said, 'Let the young woman remain with us a while, at least 10 days, after that she may go.'" It would seem expected that such a proposal would be made by her father. It is made by her, instead, rather, it's made by her mother and brother. After inquiring of Rebekah, it's decided that she would leave with the servant after all. Abraham's son then goes on to, Abraham's son Isaac goes on to marry Rebekah, and together they have a son called Jacob. After Jacob deceives his father Isaac into blessing him rather than Esau, the eldest, Rebekah counsels Jacob to flee because Esau planned to kill him. Along his journey, he encounters some shepherds and asks them, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" In Genesis 29, verse 5. That's rather strange, because Laban was the son of Bethuel and only the grandson of Nahor. Yet again, we see Bethuel passed over as an individual considered of no importance among his own family. Bethuel's own son, therefore, is identified by the name of his grandfather rather than his father. Now, we can't state the specific circumstances that surround Bethuel or explain exactly why he was a man considered of no note. Perhaps he was considered incapable of managing his own affairs due to age or imbecility. We certainly know that he was alive. Whatever the reason, Scripture does not tell us. However, the lack of concurrence in a positive fact, but silent presumption of that same fact, suggests that the author knew something more than what we do about the circumstances than he discloses in his account thereof. It's the sort of pattern that we expect in real history, but not the sort of pattern we should expect from works of fiction. Let's take another example. This is from Joshua 3, and it pertains to Rahab the prostitute. This is from Joshua 3, verses 14 through 17. So when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan with the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and as soon as those bearing the Ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the Ark were dipped in the brink of the water, now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest, the waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, and those flowing down toward the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off, and the people passed over opposite Jericho. Now the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. Now, what time of year did this event happen? Well, in Joshua 3:15, we read, the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest. In Joshua 4:19, we read, the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And so it's that is 4 days before the Passover, at which time fell the barley harvest as opposed to the later wheat harvest, which came later. Now, what crop came up together with barley? Well, if we flip over to Exodus 9, we read, the flax and the barley were struck down, for the barley was in the ear and the flax was in bud, but the wheat and the emmer were not struck down, for they are late in coming up. So that shows us that the flax and the barley came up together, whereas the wheat and emmer come up later. In Joshua 2, verse 6, we read about the spies that Joshua had sent to spy out the land of Jericho. And of course, they were hidden in the house of Rahab the prostitute. And when the soldiers came by to ask where the spies were, she lies to them and tells them that she doesn't know where they went, but really she's hidden them. And it says Rahab had brought them, the Hebrew spies, up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. And so presumably these stalks of flax had just been cut down and been spread on the roof of her house to season. The mention of the stalks of flax here is very incidental, and yet it makes perfect sense in view of our inference that the crossing of the Jordan took place at the barley harvest, which we saw from a completely unrelated text in Exodus 9 coincided with the ripening of flax. Let's take another example. This is from number 16. This is pertaining to the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Now Korah, the son of Izhar, son of Kohath, son of Levi, and Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, said, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men, and they rose up before Moses with a number of the people of Israel, 250 chiefs of the congregation, chosen from the assembly, well-known men. They assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron, and said to them, you have gone too far, for all in the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? And so here we have the story of the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Now let's flip over to Deuteronomy 3, verses 1 through 9. This is what we read. And then we turned and went away up the way to Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us and all his people to battle at Eldrai. But the Lord said to me, do not fear him, for I have okay, I'm missing a slide here. But in regards to this text, if you read numbers 2 and numbers 3, we basically learn that these sides are encamped on the same side of the tabernacle, putting them in the right place to conspire against Moses. Here's the slide. This is from Numbers 3:29. The clans of the sons of Kohath were to camp on the south side of the tabernacle. Numbers 2 verse 10 says, on the south side shall be the standard of the camp of Reuben by their companies, the chief of the people of Reuben being Eleazar, the sons of Shader. It turns out then that the family of Kohath and the family of Reuben were camped on the same side of the tabernacle, thus making them conveniently placed for taking secret counsel against Moses. So again, another example of an undesigned coincidence. Imagine you're writing a Torah scroll and you have to scroll back, 14, 15 chapters in order to find what sides are people camped on the tabernacle in order to find your best communities to conspire against Moses with. So here's another example. This is from Deuteronomy 3 verses 1 through 9, where basically we have this this incidental mention in this text in Deuteronomy 3 about Mount Hermon, which the Sidonians call Hermon Sirion, while the Amorites call it Senir. Now that's interesting because the Mount Hermon is very, very far away from Sidon, and it doesn't even seem to have belonged to the Sidonians, but rather to Og, the king of Bashan. So why does Moses mention the Sidonian name for this mountain? Well, if you look over at Judges 18, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of the people of Dan were seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in, for until then no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. So the people of Dan sent 5 able men from the whole number of their tribe, from Zorah and from Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to explore it. And they said to them, go and explore the land. And they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Milcah, and lodged there. When they were by the house of Milcah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite, and they turned aside and said to him, who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here? And he said to them, this is how Micah dealt with me. He has hired me, and I have become his priest. And they said to him, inquire of God, please, that we may know whether the journey on which we are setting out will succeed. And the priest said to them, go in peace. The journey on which you go is under the eye of the Lord. Then, and this is the part to take note of, then the 5 men departed and came to Laish and saw the people who were there, how they lived in security after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing that is in the earth and possessing wealth, and how they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. Okay. So the solution is given in, if we pay careful attention to verse 7, in which we learn that the people of Laish lived after the manner of the Sidonians. Now that suggests that the city in early times in fact belonged to Sidon and was most likely inhabited by Sidonians. Now let's put the pieces together. Consider again the first text we looked at from Deuteronomy 3, in which we read the incidental remark about Mount Hermon. Hermon, we know, was close to the ancient Roman city of Caesarea Philippi, which lay at its southwestern base. Eusebius of Caesarea, in his ecclesiastical history, informs us that Caesarea Philippi, which the Phoenicians called Peneus, springs are shown at the foot of the mountain Peneus, out of which the Jordan flows. Thus we learn that Caesarea Philippi was the modern name of Peneus. Eusebius also places Dan, or Laish, in the vicinity of Peneus at the 4th mile on the route to Tyre. Thus, it would seem that while Mount Hermon was geographically distant from Sidon, at its foot there was dwelling a Sidonian colony, who spoke the Sidonian language. This in turn illuminates for us why mention is made in Deuteronomy 3:9 of the Sidonian name for the mountain, which was Sirion. The distance and disconnectedness of the text from which this conclusion may be drawn again suggests a narrative based on truth, rather than a fictionalized account. So let's take another example of an undesigned coincidence in the Old Testament. Let's turn to Joshua chapter 3 and verses 14 through 17, in which we read the following. So when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan with the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and as soon as those bearing the Ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the Ark were dipped in the brink of the water, now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest, the waters coming down from above stewed and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, and those flowing down towards the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off. and the people passed over opposite Jericho. Now the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. At what time of year did this event happen? Well, if we look at Joshua 3:15, it gives us an important clue. The feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest. So obviously, this is taking place around the time of harvest. Now, is this taking place at the time of the barley harvest or at the time of the later wheat harvest? Well, Joshua 4:19 says the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. Now that is 4 days before the Passover, at which time fell the barley harvest. Now, which crop came up together with barley? Well, according to Exodus 9, the flax, this is speaking about the plague of hail upon the Egyptians. The flax and the barley were struck down, for the barley was in the ear, and the flax was in bud. But the wheat and the emmer were not struck down, for they are late in coming up. So, according to this text, flax and barley come up together, and later on, the wheat and the emmer come up together. Now, in Joshua 2:6, we have the story of Joshua sending in the spies to spy out the land of Jericho. And you might recall that these spies are hidden by Rahab, the prostitute, in her home. And the soldiers come to ask where the spies are, and she lies to them, tells them she doesn't know, but in fact she's hidden them. And we read in Joshua 2:6, she, that's Rahab, had brought them, the Hebrew spies, up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. Presumably these stalks of flax had just been cut down and had been spread on the roof of her house to season. But the mention of the stalks of flax here is very incidental. And yet it makes perfect sense in view of our inference that the crossing of the Jordan took place at the barley harvest, which we saw from a completely unrelated text in Exodus 9, coincided with the ripening of flax. And of course, the climate in Canaan is very similar to the climate in Egypt, and so we can expect the harvests to be very similar. Let's take another example. This is from Numbers 16, verses 1 through 3, concerning the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. This is what we read. Now Korah, the son of Izhar, son of Kohath, son of Levi, and Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men, and they rose up before Moses with a number of the people of Israel, 250 chiefs of the congregation, chosen from the assembly, well-known men. They assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron, and said to them, "You have gone too far, for all in the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" So here we see that these individuals, these groups rise up against Moses and Aaron. Now, on what side of the tabernacle were the rebelling parties camped? Well, if we flip back all the way to Numbers 3, verse 29, it says the clans of the sons of Kohath were to camp on the south side of the tabernacle. Numbers 2:10 says, "On the south side shall be the standard of the camp of Reuben by their companies, the chief of the people of Reuben being Elizur, the son of Shedeur." It turns out then, from those two different chapters in early Numbers, that the family of Kohath and the family of Reuben were camped on the same side of the tabernacle, thus making them conveniently placed for taking secret counsel together against Moses. I mean, imagine you're writing a Torah scroll and you have to scroll back, 15 chapters or something to find out, what two groups are on the same side of the tabernacle in order to have them as the co-conspirators against Moses. Deuteronomy 3 is another example. This is concerning Mount Hermon and the Sidonians. This is what we read in Deuteronomy 3. "Then we turned and went up the way to Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. But the Lord said to me, 'Do not fear him, for I have given him and all his people and his land into your hand. And you shall do to him as you did to Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon.' So the Lord our God gave into our heart Og, also the king of Bashan, and all his people, and we struck them down until he had no survivor left. And we took all his cities at that time. There was not a city where we did not take from them 60 cities, the whole region of Argob, the kingdom of Og in Bashan. All these were cities fortified with high walls, gates, and bars, besides very many unwalled villages, and we devoted them to destruction, as we did to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, devoting to destruction every city, men, women, and children. But all the livestock and the spoil of the cities we took as our plunder. So we took the land at that time out of the hand of the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, from the valley of the Arnon to Mount Hermon. The Sidonians call Hermon Syrian, while the Amorites call it Senir. So here we have just off the cuff incidental remark at the end here in verse 9, or verses 8 and 9, to Mount Hermon. And we're told in verse 9, the Sidonian name for this mountain is Syria. Now, why would Moses give us this information about the Sidonian name of Mount Hermon, especially in view of the fact that Mount Hermon is very, very far away from Sidon, and it doesn't even seem to be to belong to the Sidonians, but rather to Og, the king of Bashan. But an important part of the clue is given in Judges 18, in which we read, "In those days there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of the people of Dan was seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in. For until then no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. So the people of Dan sent 5 able men from the whole number of their tribe, from Zorah and from Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to explore it. And they said to them, 'Go and explore the land.' And they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. When they were by the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite, and they turned aside and said to him, 'Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here?' And he said to them, 'This is how Micah dealt with me. He has hired me, and I have become his priest.' And they said to him, 'Inquire of God, please, that we may know whether the journey on which we are setting out will succeed.' And the priest said to them, 'Go in peace. The journey on which you go is under the eye of the Lord. And then take careful note of what comes next.' Then the 5 men departed and came to Laish and saw the people who were there, how they lived in security, after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing that is in the earth, and possessing wealth, and how they were far from the Sidonians, and had no dealings with anyone." Now, as I said, pay careful attention to verse 7, in which we learn that the people of Laish lived after the manner of the Sidonians. This suggests that this city in early times in fact belonged to Sidon and was most likely inhabited by Sidonians. Now let's put the pieces together. Consider again the first text we looked at from Deuteronomy 3, in which we read the incidental remark about Mount Hermon. Hermon, we know, was close to the ancient Roman city of Caesarea Philippi, which lay at its southwestern base. Eusebius of Caesarea, in his ecclesiastical history, informs us that at Caesarea Philippi, which the Phoenicians call Panias, springs are shown at the foot of the mountain Panias, out of which the Jordan flows. Thus, we learn that Caesarea Philippi was the modern name of Panias. Eusebius also places Dan, or Laish, in the vicinity of Panias, at the 4th mile on the route to Tyre. Thus, it would seem that while Mount Hermon was geographically distant from Sidon, at its foot there was dwelling a Sidonian colony, who spoke the Sidonian language. This, in turn, illuminates for us why mention is made in Deuteronomy 3:9 of the Sidonian name for the mountain, which was Syrian. The distance and disconnectedness of the text from which the conclusion may be drawn again suggests a narrative based on truth rather than a fictionalized account. So, in conclusion then, undesigned coincidences can be used to corroborate and support many elements of biblical history, including in the Old Testament, the Gospels, Acts, and the epistles of Paul. They were powerful when taken as a cumulative case and support the substantial historical veracity of the biblical documents. For further reading, I'd highly recommend reading Dr. Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. This book just talks about the examples that occur between the Gospels and those which occur between Acts and the epistles. It doesn't discuss the Old Testament examples, and it doesn't discuss examples that just occur between the epistles. but it's a highly recommended book. I would suggest that Christians drop whatever book they are reading right now and read this instead, because it's a very, very good book, and I think it makes a very, very compelling argument from a whole range of different coincidences without design among the Gospels and Acts and the epistles.